The Hidden Truth Hollywood doesn't want you to know. Jesus wasn't white. For centuries, the image of Jesus in Western culture has been sculpted, painted, and portrayed as a fair-skinned, blue-eyed man. A figure of European heritage, rather, than Middle Eastern or African. Yet beneath this familiar image lies a truth that has been largely erased. A truth that Hollywood and Western society at large have repeatedly overlooked or intentionally altered. This truth is that Jesus was not a white man, but a man of color. From the Renaissance to the Golden Age of Hollywood, white portrayals of Jesus became not only accepted, but the default image. Major films like Ben-Hur and The Greatest Story Ever Told were produced, with white actors embodying Jesus, a move that reinforced a version of history aligning with Western ideals, rather than with the historical and cultural reality of Jesus's heritage. This portrayal, so widely accepted that it has become nearly invisible in its familiarity, stands in stark contrast to biblical descriptions of Jesus and the people of his time. If this perspective resonates with you, please subscribe to our channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us in uncovering truths that have long been hidden from the mainstream. 1. Hollywood's role in perpetuating a whitewashed Jesus. Hollywood, with its unparalleled reach and cultural influence, has played a monumental role in shaping global perceptions of Jesus Christ and other biblical figures. Through its films and television shows, Hollywood has largely adhered to an image of Jesus as a white man, casting Caucasian actors in roles that carry profound spiritual significance. Movies like Ben-Hur, The Greatest Story Ever Told, The Passion of the Christ, and the mini-series Jesus of Nazareth are among the most famous portrayals of Jesus, and each reinforces the image of a fair-skinned, blue-eyed, and light-haired Messiah. Though these films may vary in tone, style, and religious interpretation, they share a common thread, a portrayal of Jesus that aligns with European features rather than with the ethnic diversity of the historical figure. This repeated choice is more than an artistic decision. It is a culturally loaded one. By casting white actors as Jesus, Hollywood has cemented a particular racial identity for one of history's most revered and beloved figures. This identity shift effectively erases the historical context and ethnic background of Jesus, who was born in the Middle East. Beyond simply altering history, this portrayal places whiteness at the center of divinity, virtue, and sacred authority. Jesus, a figure meant to embody universal love, acceptance, and humanity, is recast in a way that subtly suggests these ideals are most fittingly embodied by a white man. As audiences around the world are exposed to these films, they come to associate divine qualities with whiteness, reinforcing a racial hierarchy that shapes perceptions far beyond the screen. The impact of this narrative choice is profound. For centuries, people of color have seen few, if any, reflections of themselves in the divine figures depicted in film. Hollywood's whitewashed Jesus not only robs communities of color of an authentic representation of the divine, but also positions whiteness as the default, and often the only, acceptable portrayal of holiness. The result is a deeply embedded notion that whiteness is intrinsically linked to divinity, while people of color are relegated outside this sacred framework. For people of color who worship Jesus and look to him as a source of comfort, faith, and inspiration, this exclusion can be alienating and spiritually damaging. This whitewashing of Jesus does not occur in isolation. Hollywood's pattern of casting white actors in roles meant for people of color extends far beyond biblical characters. Countless historical and fictional figures from a variety of cultural backgrounds have been reimagined with white faces, erasing their heritage and identity in favor of a Eurocentric narrative. For example, stories set in Egypt and other parts of Africa, such as Exodus, Gods and Kings, and Gods of Egypt, featured primarily white casts despite being set in ancient African civilizations. These casting decisions communicate to audiences that even in stories originating from Africa, the main characters must be portrayed by white actors, reinforcing a hierarchy that privileges whiteness as the ideal image for protagonists, leaders, and ultimately, deities. This trend creates a vicious cycle of exclusion and erasure. When viewers continually see white actors portraying characters from diverse backgrounds, they internalize a narrative that elevates whiteness as universally relatable and inherently suitable for leadership and sacred roles. In contrast, characters of color are often relegated to background roles, stereotyped characters, or roles that reinforce negative perceptions. This biased casting approach restricts the representation of people of color, keeping them from being portrayed in roles of honor, heroism, and spirituality. The result is a media landscape dominated by whiteness, with limited room for diversity in portrayals of both sacred and secular figures. Hollywood's pattern of casting white actors as Jesus and other significant figures often goes hand in hand with the stereotyping and caricaturing of people of color. Rather than allowing actors of color to portray sacred or virtuous figures, Hollywood has historically relegated them to roles that reinforce negative stereotypes. This approach not only denies people of color the opportunity to see themselves represented as divinely inspired or spiritually central, but also impacts how they are viewed in everyday society. When people of color are cast, they are often assigned roles that perpetuate harmful stereotypes. Black actors, for instance, are frequently cast in roles that highlight poverty, violence, or subservience, while actors of Middle Eastern descent are often typecast as terrorists or antagonists. These portrayals contribute to a social narrative that associates people of color with undesirable traits, which in turn affects how they are perceived in real life. For audiences, these biased portrayals compound the damage of whitewashed biblical figures by creating a dichotomy. White actors portray sacred, wise, or heroic characters, while people of color are seen as supporting, villainous, or troubled. This division reinforces a racial hierarchy that becomes ingrained in the cultural psyche, associating whiteness with divinity and authority, while marginalizing people of color. Hollywood's depiction of Jesus as white extends beyond entertainment. It actively shapes religious and racial identity. Movies and television are powerful vehicles for storytelling, and the images and narratives they present shape viewers' understanding of history, faith, and culture. In the case of religious figures like Jesus, the way Hollywood chooses to portray them can profoundly influence how millions of people imagine the divine. By consistently presenting a white Jesus, Hollywood sends a message that aligns sacredness with whiteness. This association, repeated over decades and through countless productions, influences the way people conceive of not only Jesus, but of the divine itself. For communities of color, particularly Black and Middle Eastern Christians, this narrative can be deeply alienating. The Bible tells them they are created in the image of God, yet the visual representation of God's Son is almost exclusively white. This discrepancy fosters a disconnect between their cultural identity and their faith, making it difficult to feel fully accepted in a religion that seems to visually exclude them. When Jesus is depicted as a white man, the implication is that holiness and virtue look like him, and by extension, not like them. Hollywood's role in perpetuating a whitewashed Jesus raises important questions about its responsibility to more authentically represent diverse cultures and histories. Although some progress has been made in recent years with productions that depict Jesus and other historical figures with greater cultural accuracy, these portrayals are still the exception rather than the rule. Hollywood continues to face calls to diversify its casting choices, especially in films that deal with historical or spiritual subject matter. There is a growing awareness among audiences that accurate representation is essential not only for the sake of history, but also for fostering a more inclusive and understanding society. Authentic representation allows people to connect with stories on a deeper level, seeing themselves and their ancestors reflected in narratives of faith, bravery, and resilience. By casting actors who more accurately represent the cultural and ethnic backgrounds of the characters they portray, Hollywood has the potential to create films that resonate more meaningfully with a diverse global audience. Moreover, it would help dismantle the racial hierarchy that has so long dominated religious imagery in the West. When Hollywood chooses to prioritize diversity and authenticity, it has the power to create a more inclusive cultural narrative, one that honors the true ethnic and cultural heritage of historical figures. Casting Jesus and other biblical characters accurately is a step toward recognizing and respecting the diversity of the people who lived in biblical times. It also affirms to audiences, particularly those of color, that their identities are valid, sacred, and deserving of respect and representation. In the end, Hollywood's continued portrayal of Jesus as white is more than a simple artistic choice. It is a statement about who society deems worthy of divinity and reverence. By continually casting white actors in the role of Jesus, Hollywood has reinforced a narrative that prioritizes whiteness, erases cultural diversity, and upholds a racial hierarchy that aligns holiness with European features. This portrayal affects millions of people around the world, shaping how they view themselves, others, and the divine. The call for accurate representation is not simply about diversifying Hollywood's films. It is about restoring a sense of cultural and spiritual truth. It is about recognizing that people of color deserve to see themselves in stories of faith, history, and heroism. By shifting away from a whitewashed Jesus and embracing a portrayal rooted in historical authenticity, Hollywood has an opportunity to enrich its storytelling, honoring the rich diversity of the human experience and allowing all people to feel fully included in the spiritual narratives they hold dear. 2. The truth in the Bible. The Bible offers subtle but potent indications that Jesus did not possess the pale skin and European features that have so often dominated Western portrayals. In Revelation 1:14-15, a powerful description of Jesus emerges, conveying an image quite unlike the familiar depictions that adorn churches, art, and media. The text reads, "The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace." This image of hair like wool and feet resembling burnished brass suggests a figure with features more commonly associated with African or Middle Eastern heritage than with Northern Europeans. His hair is described as textured, possibly tightly coiled, and his skin tone as dark, likened to a rich, glowing metal. Such descriptors disrupt the Europeanized versions of Jesus that have, over centuries, become the default, instead pointing toward a figure with a darker complexion and afro-textured hair. This description of Jesus is not an isolated detail, but part of a larger biblical pattern in which figures connected to Jesus' lineage are described in terms that resonate with African and Middle Eastern heritage. Born in Bethlehem, within the Roman province of Judea, Jesus lived in a region historically characterized by ethnic diversity, where African, Semitic, and other indigenous Middle Eastern peoples mingled. The faces of this population, far from resembling European features, would have included complexions ranging from light to dark, mirroring the rich diversity of people across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and North Africa. In the Song of Songs, King Solomon, an ancestor of Jesus, proclaims, "I am black but beautiful, O daughters of Jerusalem," an expression that, regardless of interpretive debates, has long been celebrated as a declaration of pride in black or dark skin, embedded within Israelite heritage. Additionally, Jesus' genealogy, tracing back through figures like Rahab, Ruth, and King David, includes individuals of varied backgrounds and complexions. These ancestors would have reflected the ethnic diversity of their time, which has too often been misrepresented or erased in Western narratives. The implications of portraying Jesus as white run deeper than a mere historical oversight. By depicting Jesus as a European, Hollywood and much of the Western world have imposed a racial identity upon one of history's most venerated figures, shaping how people across backgrounds perceive divinity, humanity, and self-worth. The choice to represent Jesus as white reinforces an association between whiteness and divinity, subtly suggesting that those with lighter skin are more aligned with the sacred. This deeply ingrained imagery casts a veil over the issue of worth in society, subtly reinforcing a hierarchy that privileges whiteness above all else and impacts how holiness and virtue are conceptualized. Imagine, for instance, the experience of generations of Black and Middle Eastern believers who, despite sharing Jesus' heritage, have only encountered him depicted with European features. This exclusionary image can create an unspoken sense of distance, making it harder for people of color to feel fully seen and included in their spiritual traditions. A whitewashed Jesus does not only distort historical reality, it perpetuates a symbolic barrier, leaving marginalized communities feeling as though they exist outside their own faith, disconnected from the divine. The repercussions of this misrepresentation run deep. When divinity is continuously depicted with white features, it subtly suggests that whiteness is synonymous with godliness. Conversely, the absence of darker-skinned images in divine representations instills a notion of otherness for people of color, both within their spiritual life and within society. Over time, this erasure integrates into a broader narrative where European features are idealized, while non-European groups are systematically denied representation. This practice, which is woven into countless cultural and religious depictions, has profoundly affected the self-conception of generations, embedding a notion of spirituality and belonging that is exclusionary by nature. The whitewashing of Jesus predates Hollywood, tracing back to the art and ideologies of the European Renaissance. During this period, artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, commissioned by wealthy patrons and the Catholic Church, produced religious art that conformed to the aesthetic preferences of their sponsors. Sacred figures, including Jesus, were depicted with European features that bore little resemblance to the peoples of Jesus' historical era and region. Jesus was portrayed with pale skin, light eyes, and straight or wavy hair, not for reasons of accuracy, but to mirror the people of power. These images became so deeply ingrained in Western Christianity that, as Europe expanded its colonial influence, they carried the image of a white Jesus to far-flung lands. Colonial powers wielded this visual narrative as a tool of domination, using it to justify the superiority of European life, culture, and appearance over others. The image of a white Jesus became integral to this agenda, equating whiteness with divinity while casting indigenous people and people of color as savage or heathen. A Europeanized Jesus lent credence to the colonial project, enabling Europeans to present themselves as bringers of civilization and Christian virtue, even as they exploited and oppressed non-European peoples. Depicting Jesus as white during this era was more than an artistic choice. It was a deliberate ideological strategy, one that solidified racial and cultural superiority. By aligning religious authority and moral virtue with European features, colonizers constructed a system that positioned themselves as both spiritually and culturally dominant. This association between whiteness and divinity provided a powerful, lasting justification for the exploitation of people of color, reinforcing a racial hierarchy that stripped non-European communities of their cultural and religious identity. This concept of white supremacy has not simply faded with time. It has seeped into modern Western society and remains visible in contemporary media, art, and even within some religious institutions. Each time Hollywood releases a film depicting a white Jesus, it renews this racial ideology, perpetuating associations of whiteness with authority, divinity, and cultural legitimacy, while sidestepping representations that could expand and deepen our understanding of spirituality. The movement toward a historically accurate portrayal of Jesus is not simply about correcting a factual error. It represents a movement toward healing and inclusion. Embracing an image of Jesus that aligns with historical descriptions offers a profound affirmation to people of color who may have felt estranged from conventional religious iconography. It invites them to see themselves reflected in their religious narratives, fostering a stronger connection to their spirituality. It validates their cultural identity within the sacred story, a reminder that their heritage, too, forms part of the divine narrative. Choosing to portray Jesus with historically accurate characteristics described in the Bible. Hair like wool, skin like burnished bronze, marks a step in dismantling the lingering effects of colonialism and racial bias in Western Christianity. It affirms that divinity is not confined to a single race or culture, but is universal, accessible to all. In recent years, some media productions have taken steps toward this authenticity. Films like Color of the Cross, which presents Jesus as a black man, serve not only as historical corrections, but as much-needed challenges to entrenched racial biases within media. Such portrayals allow audiences to reconsider Jesus' story in a fresh light, affirming that his teachings transcend race and culture, even as they acknowledge the specific heritage that shaped him. These films encourage a more inclusive and compassionate spirituality, one that respects diversity instead of erasing it. By embracing the full scope of Jesus' heritage, we foster a greater understanding of his universal message, a message that champions equality and rejects racial privilege. In this journey to reclaim an accurate image of Jesus, we confront outdated and harmful narratives, seeking a vision of faith that genuinely reflects humanity's diverse composition. By embracing the true cultural diversity embedded in the biblical narrative, we affirm the truth that all people are made in the image of God, each with a unique heritage that deserves recognition and celebration. In doing so, we honor not only the historical figure of Jesus, but the vast spectrum of humanity that his life and message sought to uplift.